Trust is like sponsorship papers. Once you sign, you can't take it back, even when you realize the person you're helping isn't who they said they were. Even when they're sitting across from you in a courtroom saying things that could destroy what's left of your life. I'm 71 years old, and I thought I'd learned enough about people to protect myself. I was wrong. Sometimes the biggest mistake isn't falling for someone, it's trying to save them. If our stories resonate with you, don't forget to like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. This story was shared with us by one of our longtime viewers, and he wanted his experience heard. The courtroom smells like old wood and fear. I'm sitting behind my lawyer, watching Rochelle take the witness stand. She looks smaller than I remember, more fragile. Her long black hair is pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she's wearing a navy dress that makes her look like a student. Nothing like the confident woman who lived in my house for 8 months. "Can you tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Gerald Morrison?" the prosecutor asks. My stomach drops. Even hearing my name in this context feels wrong. Rochelle adjusts the microphone and speaks in that soft voice I used to find comforting. "He brought me to Canada to control me," she says. "He monitored my phone calls. He decided where I could go and who I could talk to. He said if I didn't follow his rules, he would send me back to the Philippines. I want to stand up and scream that it wasn't like that, that I was trying to help her adjust, that I worried about her because she seemed lost and scared. But my lawyer's hand on my arm keeps me seated. Mr. Morrison made me feel like I owed him everything," Rochelle continues, "like I was his property because he signed papers for me." The judge is taking notes, nodding occasionally. His expression is stern, focused. I try to remember how proud I felt 18 months ago when I first submitted those sponsorship documents. I thought I was giving someone a chance at a better life. Now I'm being painted as some kind of predator. "Did Mr. Morrison ever threaten you?" the prosecutor asks. Rochelle pauses, and for a moment I see something flicker across her face. Doubt? Fear? But it passes quickly. "Yes," she says. "He said if I caused trouble, he would make sure I never got permanent residency. He said he had connections with immigration and could ruin my future." That's not what happened. I never said those words. But listening to her testimony, I'm starting to understand how my worry could have been interpreted as threats, how my questions about her plans could have sounded like control. The scary thing is, part of her story makes sense. I did ask who she was talking to on the phone. I did worry when she wouldn't tell me where she was going. I did remind her that our sponsorship agreement meant we needed to stay in contact. But in her version, my concern becomes manipulation. My care becomes control. After Margaret died 3 years ago, I thought loneliness would eventually fade. It didn't. The house felt too quiet, too empty. My daughter Sarah visited every Sunday, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Dad, you need to get out more," she'd say. "Maybe try one of those senior centers, or online dating." Online dating? At 71 felt ridiculous, but Sarah set up a profile for me anyway. Not for marriage, she insisted, just for companionship. The Filipino dating site was her idea. "They have a good reputation," she said. "Family-oriented women who appreciate older men." I was skeptical, but after weeks of staring at the same 4 walls, I decided to try. Rochelle's profile caught my attention immediately. 25 years old, studying nursing in Cebu, working part-time at a call center to support her family. Her photos showed a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was wearing scrubs in one picture, standing with what looked like classmates. Another showed her with an elderly woman she described as her grandmother. Her message was simple. "Hello, Gerald, I read your profile and you seem like a kind man. I would love to learn about Canada and your work in construction. My dream is to be a nurse and help people." Our first video call lasted 2 hours. She was curious about everything. The weather in Calgary, what construction work was like, how long I'd been married. "Your wife was lucky," she said when I mentioned Margaret. "You must miss her very much." Her English was good, but not perfect, which somehow made her seem more genuine. She told me about her nursing classes, the long hours at the call center, and her worry about her mother who had diabetes. Healthcare here is expensive, she explained. I work hard to help my family, but sometimes it's not enough. I found myself looking forward to our daily calls. Rochelle was interested in my stories about building homes and commercial projects. She asked thoughtful questions about Canadian winters and what retirement was like. Unlike the few local women I'd met through the senior center, Rochelle never seemed bored or impatient. She genuinely wanted to know about my life. I admire your work ethic, I told her one evening. Studying and working at the same time can't be easy. She smiled sadly. My mother raised me to be strong. She says education is the only way to build a better future. That's when she first mentioned money troubles, not directly. She wasn't asking for anything, but she talked about having to choose between buying textbooks and helping with her mother's medical bills, about missing classes because she couldn't afford the transportation fee. I started sending small amounts. $50 here, $100 there. Not enough to hurt my budget, but enough to help with her immediate problems. Rochelle's gratitude was overwhelming. You are an angel, she would say. I don't know what I did to deserve your kindness. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt needed again. I had a purpose beyond just existing. I was helping someone build a better life. 6 months into our relationship, small inconsistencies started appearing in Rochelle's stories. Nothing dramatic, just details that didn't quite match. She told me her father died when she was 15, but later mentioned something he'd said to her recently. When I asked about it, she laughed it off. I meant my stepfather. Sometimes I still think of him as my real father. Her work schedule seemed to change frequently, too. Some days, she was at the call center from 8 to midnight. Other days, she had morning shifts. When I asked about the inconsistency, she explained that they rotated shifts to accommodate different time zones. It made sense, but something felt off. The most troubling was her English. During our early calls, she would occasionally struggle with complex sentences or use slightly incorrect grammar, but sometimes she would use sophisticated vocabulary and speak with perfect fluency. I practice English all day at work, she explained, when I mentioned it. Some days I'm more tired and make more mistakes. My daughter Sarah was less charitable when I mentioned these observations during one of our Sunday dinners. Dad, these are classic signs of a scam, she said. Multiple stories, changing details, perfect English that comes and goes. She's probably not even who she says she is. I defended Rochelle. She's not asking me for money, Sarah. She's never once asked for anything. But you're sending money anyway, Sarah pointed out. That's how these things work. They make you think it was your idea. To prove Sarah wrong, I asked Rochelle to send me photos of her daily life. She obliged immediately. Pictures of herself in nursing scrubs at the hospital where she did clinical rotations, photos with her family at Sunday dinner, selfies from the call center. One showed her with her mother, both of them smiling in what looked like a small but clean apartment. See, I told Sarah, these aren't stock photos. She's real and her life is exactly what she described. But Sarah's warnings had planted a seed of doubt. I started paying closer attention to Rochelle's stories, looking for inconsistencies. The more I watched, the more I convinced myself that Sarah was wrong. Rochelle's life seemed authentic, her struggles real. Her gratitude when I sent money for her mother's medication seemed genuine. I decided my daughter was just being overprotective. Looking back, I wonder if I was deliberately ignoring red flags because I didn't want to lose the connection I'd found with Rochelle. The loneliness had been so overwhelming that I preferred a complicated truth to an empty house. Flying to the Philippines felt like the biggest adventure I'd had since Margaret died. I'd never been to Southeast Asia, never traveled alone internationally. Rochelle met me at the airport in Cebu, and seeing her in person was surreal. She was exactly as beautiful as her photos, but smaller than I'd expected, more delicate. "Gerald," she called out, waving from behind the barrier. When she hugged me, she felt tiny in my arms. "I can't believe you're really here," she whispered. The next few days were like a carefully orchestrated tour. Rochelle showed me around Cebu, introduced me to her family, and took me to the hospital, where she did her clinical rotations. Her mother was exactly as she'd described. a kind woman with diabetes who spoke limited English but smiled warmly at me. Her grandmother, who I'd seen in photos, welcomed me like family. "You are very good to my granddaughter," she said through Rochelle's translation. But something felt rehearsed about it all. The family's reactions seemed too perfect, their gratitude too practiced. When I mentioned this to Rochelle, she laughed. "Filipino families are very warm," she said. "We show respect to guests, especially those who help us." Her home was modest but clean, a small concrete house with basic furniture and family photos on the walls. It didn't match her earlier descriptions of severe poverty, but it wasn't luxurious either. When I mentioned this discrepancy, Rochelle explained that they'd recently moved to a better area using money I'd sent. "Your help allowed us to find a safer neighborhood," she said. That made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing a performance designed to validate my investment in her story. On my third day, Rochelle brought up Canada. We were sitting in a small restaurant overlooking the city, and she was talking about her nursing ambitions. "I've been researching opportunities in Canada," she said casually. "The pay is much better there and the working conditions are safer." I asked if she was thinking about immigration. Her eyes lit up. "Do you think it would be possible? I know it's expensive and complicated, but maybe someday." That's when I made the decision that would change both our lives. "What if I sponsored you?" I asked. "I'm Canadian, I have the financial means, and you have skills Canada needs. It could work." Rochelle's reaction was immediate and emotional. She started crying, covering her face with her hands. "Gerald, I couldn't ask you to do something so big." "You're not asking," I said. "I'm offering. I want to help you build the life you've been working toward." The gratitude in her eyes felt genuine, overwhelming. We spent the rest of my visit researching the sponsorship process and gathering the documents she would need. Rochelle had everything ready: education transcripts, employment records, medical certificates. Her efficiency in gathering paperwork should have raised questions, but I was too focused on making the process work to think critically about her preparation. Back in Calgary, I dove into the Canadian immigration system with the determination I'd once brought to construction projects. The process was more complex than I'd anticipated: hundreds of pages of forms, strict financial requirements, and endless documentation. My lawyer, recommended by Sarah despite her ongoing skepticism, walked me through the legal obligations. "You understand that sponsorship is a significant commitment," she said. "You're responsible for Rochelle's financial support for up to 3 years, regardless of your relationship status. If she receives any government assistance, you'll be required to repay it." I signed the papers without hesitation. The financial requirements were substantial. I had to prove income above a certain threshold and demonstrate assets sufficient to support both of us. Liquidating some of Margaret's life insurance investments covered the immediate costs, but the ongoing obligation would require careful budgeting. Rochelle needed money for document translations, medical exams, and English language testing. Each request came with detailed explanations and receipts, but the amounts added up quickly. $500 for certified translations, $300 for medical tests, $400 for language assessment fees. My savings account, healthy when this process started, began showing the strain. The immigration interviews were the most stressful part. Officers questioned our relationship extensively, asking for proof of ongoing communication and evidence of genuine connection. I provided months of video call logs, money transfer receipts, and photos from my trip to the Philippines. "What are your intentions with Miss Rochelle?" one officer asked. "Are you planning marriage?" I explained our arrangement honestly, that I was helping a qualified young woman build a nursing career in Canada, not pursuing a romantic relationship. The officer seemed skeptical, but didn't challenge the explanation further. Rochelle's English test results were impressive, and her nursing credentials translated well to Canadian standards. The medical exams showed she was healthy and free from communicable diseases. On paper, she was an ideal candidate for immigration. 8 months after I submitted the initial application, Rochelle's visa was approved. The relief I felt was enormous, partly because the process was finally complete, but mainly because I hadn't let her down. She would have her chance at a better life in Canada. "I can never repay your kindness," she said during our celebration call. "You have given me everything I dreamed of." At the time, I believed that was true. I thought I was giving her opportunity, and she was giving me purpose. I didn't realize that we both had very different definitions of what this arrangement meant. Rochelle arrived in Calgary on February 14th, Valentine's Day, though neither of us mentioned the irony. The temperature was -28 Celsius, and she stepped off the plane wearing a thin jacket and canvas shoes. "Welcome to Canada," I said, wrapping my winter coat around her shoulders. She was shivering so hard she could barely speak. I'd prepared the guest bedroom with everything I thought she might need: warm clothes in various sizes, basic toiletries, and information about English classes and nursing programs. The first few weeks felt like hosting a grateful exchange. Student. Rochelle cooked Filipino dishes that filled the house with unfamiliar but pleasant aromas. She shared stories about her family and asked thoughtful questions about Canadian culture. She seemed genuinely amazed by simple things: the reliable electricity, the hot water that never ran out, the abundance of food in grocery stores. "Everything is so clean here," she would say, "and people follow the traffic rules." Her wonder at mundane Canadian life was endearing, but also concerning. She rarely left the house unless I drove her somewhere, and she showed no interest in exploring the city independently. When I suggested she might want to visit the nearby shopping mall or library, she would nod politely but never follow through. "I'm still adjusting," she would say. "Everything is so different here." I enrolled her in an English as a second language program at the community college, thinking it would help her meet people and improve her language skills for nursing school. She attended the first few classes, but complained that the material was too basic. "I already speak English well," she said. "These classes are for beginners." When I suggested she might test out of the basic level, she became defensive. "I need time to understand how things work here first." Her phone became her primary companion. She spent hours every day talking to people in the Philippines, speaking rapid Tagalog that I couldn't understand. When I asked who she was talking to, she would say family or friends from school, but she never offered specifics. The calls often lasted late into the night, and I could hear her voice through the thin walls of the guest bedroom. She sounded different during these conversations, more animated, more confident than she seemed in person. After a month, I suggested she might want to start looking for part-time work or volunteer opportunities at local hospitals. Canada recognizes Filipino nursing credentials with some additional training, and I thought getting familiar with the healthcare system would help her career goals. Rochelle's response surprised me. "I'm not ready for that yet," she said firmly. "I need more time to adapt to Canadian culture before I can work with patients." When I pressed gently, asking what specific aspects of adaptation she was struggling with, she became emotional. "You don't understand how hard this is," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "Everything is different here. The cold, the language, the way people interact. I can't just jump into working with sick people when I'm still learning how to live here." Her distress seemed genuine, so I backed off. But privately, I wondered why someone who had worked in healthcare in the Philippines would find Canadian hospitals so intimidating. The nursing profession has universal elements, and her English was clearly adequate for professional communication. 3 months after Rochelle's arrival, something fundamental shifted in our household dynamic. The grateful, adaptable young woman, who had been so appreciative of everything, Canadian began expressing dissatisfaction with nearly every aspect of her life in Calgary. It started with small complaints. The house was too cold, even with the heating turned up. The food in grocery stores was expensive and tasteless compared to Philippines markets. Canadian people were cold and unfriendly, not warm and family-oriented like Filipinos. I tried to be understanding. Culture shock is real, and adjusting to a new country is challenging. But her criticisms began extending to my lifestyle and choices. "Why do you eat so much processed food?" she asked one morning, as I prepared my usual breakfast of cereal and toast. "This is not healthy. In Philippines, we eat fresh fruit and rice." She started cooking elaborate Filipino meals every day, often using expensive ingredients she insisted were necessary for authentic flavors. When I mentioned that the grocery bills had doubled, She accused me of being cheap. "You brought me here," she said. "Did you expect me to eat like a Canadian and forget my culture?" Her social life, previously non-existent, suddenly exploded. Filipino friends began appearing at the house without advance notice. She would introduce them briefly. "This is Maria from my ESL class," or "This is Roberto, he works downtown," but offer no other details about how she'd met them or what their relationship was. These friends would stay for hours, talking, in Tagalog, and treating my home like a community center. When I asked Rochelle to give me advance notice about visitors, she became indignant. "In Filipino culture, friends are always welcome," she said. "We don't make appointments to see people we care about." The most troubling change was her attitude toward our sponsorship arrangement. During our early months of correspondence, she had been effusively grateful for my help and expressed excitement about building a nursing career. Now she spoke about the sponsorship as if it were something I owed her rather than something I'd chosen to do. "You said you wanted to help me," she would say, when I asked about her job search or education plans. Helping means letting me adjust at my own pace, not pressuring me to become Canadian immediately. She started researching Canadian law obsessively, spending hours on legal websites and forums. When I asked what she was reading about, she said she was learning her rights as a sponsored person. The phrase made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why. One evening, I noticed her phone was recording during our dinner conversation. When I asked about it, she said she was practicing English pronunciation by recording herself speaking. But the phone was pointed toward me, not toward her, and she made no attempt to practice pronunciation during the conversation. When I mentioned this discrepancy, she became angry. "You don't trust me," she said. "You brought me here, but you still think I'm lying to you." That night, lying awake in my bedroom, I realized that the woman living in my guest room was not the same person I had sponsored. Whether she had changed due to the stress of immigration, or whether I had simply never known her true personality, I was living with someone who felt like a stranger who had legal rights to live in my house and who was becoming increasingly hostile to the man who had made her life in Canada possible. By the 4th month, Rochelle's behavior had escalated beyond general dissatisfaction into something that felt deliberately provocative. She began making subtle but pointed comments to neighbors when she encountered them in the driveway or at the mailbox. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, mentioned during a casual conversation that Rochelle had seemed upset about something during their brief interaction. "She mentioned that adjusting to Canadian men is difficult," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "that sometimes cultural differences create tension." When I asked Rochelle about this conversation, she denied saying anything concerning. "I was just making small talk," she said. "Maybe she misunderstood because of my accent." But the pattern continued. The mailman, the grocery store clerk, even Sarah during her weekly visits, began mentioning that Rochelle had made cryptic comments about feeling controlled or monitored. Each incident, viewed individually, seemed minor, but together, they created a narrative that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Rochelle's phone activity became more secretive. She would take calls outside, even in freezing weather, or lock herself in the guest bedroom for hours-long conversations. When I asked who she was talking to, her answers became evasive. "People from the Filipino community," she would say. "You wouldn't know them." One evening I heard her speaking English during one of these calls, which contradicted her previous claims that she spoke Tagalog with her family and friends. The conversation sounded professional, formal, like she was consulting with someone in an official capacity. When she emerged from the bedroom, I asked directly who she had been talking to. "My cousin," she said without hesitation. "She works for the government in Philippines and speaks English at work." The lie was obvious. I had heard her give personal details about our living arrangement and mention specific Canadian laws. But when I challenged her story, she became emotionally distraught. "You're monitoring my phone calls now?" she said, tears streaming down her face. "I can't even have privacy to talk to my family." Her distress seemed so genuine that I questioned my own perceptions. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. Maybe the stress of having another person in my previously solitary life was making me suspicious, of innocent behavior. But then I found the notebook. While cleaning the guest bedroom, which Rochelle had requested I not enter without permission, I discovered a small spiral notebook filled with dated entries in English. The handwriting was clearly hers, and the contents made my blood run cold. The entries documented our daily interactions in detail, but from a perspective that transformed every conversation into evidence of emotional abuse. My questions about her job search became harassment about employment. My concerns about her late-night phone calls became monitoring personal communications. My requests for advance notice about visitors became controlling social interactions. Most disturbingly, she had recorded direct quotes from our conversations, but edited them to remove context that would explain my motivations. A conversation where I had asked, "Who were you talking to for 3 hours last night? I was concerned because you seemed upset," was recorded as, "Gerald demanded to know who I was talking to and for how long." When I confronted Rochelle about the notebook, she didn't deny keeping it. Instead, she justified it as documentation for my protection. "You don't realize how your behavior affects me," she said. "Writing things down helps me understand my feelings and remember what really happened." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Rochelle wasn't struggling to adapt to Canada. She was methodically building a case against me, documenting our interactions as evidence of psychological abuse. The young woman I thought I was helping was preparing to use the very system I had navigated to bring her to Canada as a weapon against me. Sarah had been skeptical of the sponsorship from the beginning, but even she seemed shocked when I described Rochelle's recent behavior during our Sunday dinner. "Dad, you need to get legal advice immediately," she said. "This sounds like she's building a case for something." I had been reluctant to involve lawyers, hoping the situation would resolve itself as Rochelle adjusted to Canadian life. But the notebook discovery had shattered any remaining illusions about her intentions. The immigration lawyer, who had helped with the original sponsorship, was direct in her assessment. Sponsored individuals who claim domestic abuse can access special programs that fast-track their permanent residency, she explained. They can also receive government assistance that you would be legally obligated to repay. If she makes a formal complaint, you'll be investigated by multiple agencies. The potential consequences were staggering. Beyond the financial liability, a substantiated abuse claim could result in criminal charges, asset forfeiture, and permanent damage to my reputation. "What can I do to protect myself?" I asked. The lawyer's advice was sobering. "Document everything. Record conversations if it's legal in your jurisdiction. Keep receipts for all money spent on her behalf. But understand that the system is designed to protect sponsored individuals from genuine abuse, which means the burden of proof largely falls on you to demonstrate that her claims are false." That evening, I attempted to have a calm conversation with Rochelle about our living arrangement and her long-term plans. I thought that if I could understand her perspective, we might be able to resolve the growing tension between us. "Rochelle," I said as she prepared dinner, "I've been thinking that maybe we should discuss how things are going and what you're hoping to accomplish here." Her response was immediate and defensive. "What do you mean, accomplish? You make it sound like I have some hidden agenda." I tried to explain that I was simply trying to understand her goals for education, career, and independence, but every question I asked was interpreted as criticism or control. When I mentioned that she seemed unhappy and asked what I could do to make her transition easier, she accused me of gaslighting her. "You create problems and then pretend to want to solve them," she said. "That's what abusers do." The word abuser hung in the air between us like an accusation. I realized that in her mind, I had already been convicted of emotional abuse. Every interaction was filtered through that assumption, making genuine communication impossible. That night, I called Sarah and told her about the conversation. "Dad, she's using language that sounds like she's been coached," Sarah said. "Terms like gaslighting and abuser aren't typically part of casual conversation for someone still adjusting to English. Someone has been teaching her how to frame this situation." The possibility that Rochelle was receiving guidance from advocacy groups or lawyers made the situation even more alarming. I was facing not just one young woman's accusations, but potentially an organized effort to establish abuse claims that could destroy my life. Over the next few days, I noticed Rochelle making phone calls immediately after any interaction between us. She would disappear into her room and speak in hushed, urgent English to someone who was clearly advising her on legal matters. The woman I had thought I was helping to build a new life was systematically preparing to tear mine apart. The confrontation I had been dreading finally came on a Tuesday evening in July. I had discovered another concerning piece of evidence: credit card charges for items I hadn't purchased, including a new smartphone, expensive clothing, and what appeared to be legal consultation fees. When I approached Rochelle with the statements, intending to discuss the unauthorized charges calmly, she was ready for me. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table where we'd shared hundreds of meals over the past 8 months. "There are some charges on my credit card that I don't recognize, and I need to understand what's happening." Rochelle didn't even look at the statements. Instead, she pulled out her own folder of documents, copies of the notebook entries I'd discovered, printed emails, and what looked like legal forms. "Gerald," she said, her voice steady and cold, "we do need to talk, but not about credit cards, about how you've been treating me since I arrived in Canada." What followed was a 40-minute monologue that felt like a prosecutor's opening statement. Rochelle accused me of bringing her to Canada under false pretenses, promising support for her career while actually intending to control her life. She claimed I monitored her communications, restricted her freedom of movement, and used financial dependence to manipulate her behavior. "You told me you wanted to help me build a better life," she said, "but what you really wanted was someone grateful enough to put up with your controlling behavior. You think because you paid for my immigration that you own me." Each accusation contained enough truth to be plausible while ignoring the context that would explain my actions. Yes, I had asked about her phone calls because I was concerned about her emotional state. Yes, I had opinions about her spending because I was paying for everything. Yes, I had encouraged her to pursue education and employment because that was supposed to be the purpose of her immigration. But in Rochelle's version, my concern became surveillance, my financial responsibility became control, and my encouragement became harassment. "I never signed up to be your live-in companion or entertainment," she continued. "I came here to become a nurse and build a career, but you've made that impossible by creating a hostile environment where I'm constantly questioned and criticized." When I tried to respond, to explain my perspective or ask specific questions about her accusations, she cut me off. "Don't interrupt me," she said firmly. "You've controlled this conversation for 8 months. Now it's my turn to speak." The most chilling moment came when she pulled out her phone and placed it on the table, clearly recording our interaction. "If you try to terminate the sponsorship or force me to leave," she said, "I'll file formal complaints with immigration, authorities, and local police. I have documented evidence of psychological abuse and financial control. You'll lose everything: your reputation, your assets, potentially your freedom." The threat was delivered calmly, matter-of-factly, like she was reading from a script, which I realized she probably was. This entire confrontation had been planned, rehearsed, and designed to establish clear legal leverage over me. "Rochelle," I said carefully, aware that my words were being recorded, "I never intended to make you feel controlled or abused. If my behavior has been inappropriate, I apologize, but these accusations are based on misunderstandings. I brought you here to help you, not to hurt you." She smiled for the first time in months, but it was cold and calculating. "That's what all abusers say," she replied. "They claim good intentions while destroying people's lives." The conversation ended with Rochelle returning to her room and making a long phone call in English to someone who was clearly advising her on next steps. I sat alone in my kitchen, realizing that the young woman I had tried to help had just delivered an ultimatum that could destroy everything I had worked for in my 71 years of life. The sponsorship that was supposed to be an act of kindness had become a legal trap, and I was completely unprepared for the battle that was about to begin. 2 weeks after our confrontation, a police officer appeared at my door with a restraining order and official notification that I was under investigation for domestic abuse. The young officer, probably in his 30s, seemed uncomfortable as he explained that Rochelle had filed a formal complaint alleging psychological abuse, financial control, and threats related to immigration status. "Sir, I need to inform you that you cannot contact Miss Rochelle directly or through third parties," he said, reading from the legal document. "You cannot enter the residence at 247 Oak Street, the address of the women's shelter where Rochelle had moved, and you must maintain a distance of at least 500 meters from her person." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being ordered to stay away from someone who was living in my house 2 weeks ago. "Officer," I asked, "what happens to the sponsorship obligations while this investigation is ongoing?" He consulted his paperwork. "You're still legally responsible for her support," he said. "The restraining order doesn't affect your financial obligations under federal immigration law, so I was required to continue paying for Rochelle's living expenses while being prohibited from any contact with her and facing investigation for abusing her. The legal system had created a perfect trap. My lawyer, Sarah, and I spent the following days trying to understand the full scope of the allegations. Rochelle's complaint was detailed and comprehensive, supported by the notebook entries, recorded conversations, and testimony from witnesses I'd never met who claimed to have observed my controlling behavior. "She's built a compelling case," my lawyer admitted during our consultation. "The documentation is extensive, and the witness statements support her narrative. Even if the individual incidents are exaggerated or taken out of context, the pattern appears consistent with psychological abuse. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Legal fees for both immigration and criminal lawyers consumed my monthly budget quickly. The requirement to maintain Rochelle's support payments while she lived in subsidized shelter housing meant I was essentially paying twice, once to the government for her expenses and once to lawyers to defend myself against her accusations." Sarah tried to be supportive, but I could see the strain this situation was putting on our relationship. "Dad, I warned you about this," she said during one of our increasingly tense conversations. "I know you meant well, but you put yourself in an impossible situation with someone you barely knew." Her words stung because they were true. I had let loneliness cloud my judgment, and my desire to help someone had been weaponized against me. The community reaction was swift and devastating. Neighbors who had known me for 20 years began treating me with suspicion and distance. Mrs. Patterson, who had been friendly for decades, now avoided eye contact when she saw me checking the mail. The story of my investigation spread through our small neighborhood, and I could feel people's opinions changing with each retelling. At the grocery store, the bank, and the post office, places where I'd been a familiar face for years, staff interactions became formal and cold. I realized that regardless of the investigation's outcome, my reputation in the community where I'd planned to spend my remaining years was permanently damaged. The isolation was crushing. Margaret's death had left me lonely. But this was different. This was the loneliness of being actively avoided by people who once respected me. I had tried to escape solitude by helping someone, and instead had created a situation that made me a pariah in my own neighborhood. Each morning brought new legal documents, procedural requirements, and bills from various professionals who were now managing my life. The simple existence I'd once taken for granted had been replaced by a complex legal battle that consumed every aspect of my daily routine. The courtroom where I now found myself was the same one where I'd attended jury duty 15 years earlier. Then I had been a respected member of the community serving civic responsibility. Now I was a defendant facing accusations that could end my life as I knew it. Rochelle's testimony was devastating in its precision and emotional impact. She spoke clearly and confidently, describing a relationship that bore little resemblance to my memory of our 8 months together. In her version, I was a manipulative older man who had used the promise of help to lure her into an abusive situation. "Mr. Morrison presented himself as a kind sponsor," she said, looking directly at the judge. "But from the moment I arrived, he monitored my every move. He questioned who I talked to on the phone, criticized my friends, and made me account for Every dollar spent. When I tried to establish independence, he threatened to send me back to the Philippines. Her English was flawless now. No trace of the occasional uncertainty I remembered from our early conversations. Either her language skills had improved dramatically under stress, or the hesitant English during our video calls had been an act designed to make her seem more vulnerable and genuine. The recordings she had made were played in court, and they were damning. My voice, taken out of context, sounded controlling and demanding. Questions I had asked out of concern sounded like interrogation. Discussions about budgeting sounded like financial abuse. "Do you recognize your voice on this recording?"